Alrighty, so you can see my very awesome Twitch skills as I'm clearly very experienced at doing this. So tonight we're just going to do a short stream, probably just going till about 9 p.m. Starting to look at some of the GM rules for the game. So if you missed it over on twitch.tv/actualplay, we played a 0 session for this game. It's called Crossing Worlds, used to be called Karma in the Dark. And that session was about the players creating their world, their team, and their characters. And hey, Brian. So now we're going to look at the GM side of it. And because Brian plays in the game he asked, this won't be a spoilery GM prep. We're going to talk a little bit about GM principles. And then we're going to start setting goals for the factions, which in the game don't tend to be secret from players. NPCs might have secret goals, but the factions, they can kind of just know about the politics. And if you see me looking over a lot, it's because I have another monitor for chat, because I'm actually streaming from a computer that is so old it would probably shut down if I tried to have Twitch running at the same time. So what we can see is I have the best practices chapter over here and all of its Google Doc glory. We're just going to scroll past all of the player stuff because that's for players to read and go to the GM section. Excuse me. And what we're going to see is the game takes a lot of inspiration from Apocalypse World and games like that that like to give some specific information and guide for the GM. And the longer I've GM'd, the more I found that I like this material because as a GM you have so many things you're thinking about. It's helpful if the rules kind of give you structure. So the first section I'm not really going to spend much time on. It's just kind of basic how to GM information. But if we keep going down, we get to the agendas and principles. And I was just going to review these before I start setting faction goals, because basically everything I'm going to do in GM prep is supposed to tie back to this agenda and to these principles. And these have been changed somewhat in this set of the game. So the agenda for the GM is to portray a gray versus gray world. And that's the idea that there is no black and white, there is no clear good and bad, right and wrong. And so as the GM, it's about kind of complicating everything that the players are facing and having to decide. It's my agenda to fill the characters live with adventure and conflict and kind of balance both of those. We want some fun, epic adventure, but also some good character and moral conflict as we go on. And then pretty much a standard agenda item now for if you've ever played a Played by the Apocalypse or Powered by the Apocalypse game, which is to play to find out what happens. So this game is very much about improv as the GM. You have some skills and some ideas, but you don't really have anything determined until the players start responding to the world. So let's look at the principles. Some of these are going to be pretty standard, but some of them are really about trying to make players feel the pain of trying to rebel. So they want to rebel, they want to resist, and the entire world basically wants to stop and crush them. And so as the GM, a lot of these are about bringing that reality to life. So you can see the first one is show what they love and make them choose. And on that note, I went in and looked at what my characters said they cared about. I hadn't actually read all of these while we were streaming. So as a GM, it's kind of nice because every player had to pick a personal code, but then they also picked XP triggers, so you can kind of see what are the things they want to do. So if we have Juno, who is our broker, with the code if someone acts selfishly, I'll always intimidate them into helping others. So I'm already thinking about populating the world with selfish characters that she's going to have to deal with. And her main approach is charming and intimidating. But then something that's interesting here is her her interest is gaining another's support. So that'll be kind of fun to play with because if she sees someone selfish, she wants to intimidate them into helping. But that's a little different than gaining their support. Well, we'll have to see. So Locker is our cyborg. and we talked a lot on the stream about their personal code, which is if I see corporate brands, I will always destroy them. I think that one will be pretty easy to set up. And we've got some XP triggers of honesty, rampage, and pushing your limits. So the interesting thing about Locker is Locker's kind of a single theme character right now. You know, be honest, censor people, be blunt, rampage. So we're going to find out once we start playing what Locker wants to protect, and then kind of put that opposite, this sort of push yourself and destroy everything in your path approach. Then we have Zephyr, who is our mystic. And this is going to be really interesting playing off Locker, because their personal code is if a vulnerable person is hurt, I will always show compassion. So you can always see that if Juno is intimidating people and Locker is rampaging, Zephyr is going to feel pulled to show them compassion. At the same time, they get their XP from showing athletic skill, daredevilry, and learning from the source. And so that'll actually balance out well, because their daredevil XP trigger will sort of feed into the rampage and the intimidation, so it won't be complete conflict between all the characters. And then we have October, who is our virtual artist. And I had totally missed this personal code until I was reading them tonight. And this personal code is, if an off-worlder wants a dream, then I will make it a nightmare. And they are rebelling against tyranny. So thank you, Brian. I think that's going to be a very fun way to get some tension. And you can see that goes with the XP triggers of disruption and innovation. And the interest of weaponizing information. And October distrusts people. So one thing I like sort of as a GM is we have this principle, show them what they love and make them choose. And already if you just look at what the characters have in terms of their personal codes, their XP triggers, which people always want to get XP in advance, their rebellions, in a lot of ways you can just put the characters sort of against each other and let them choose who's kind of gonna get what they want in each situation. So the next principle goes sort of in a similar vein, which is tempt them with easy success at the cost of selling out. And so this is kind of that bait and switch of, well, if you go right, the path is really difficult. If you go left, it's super easy, but you're going to have to compromise. And so when we think about the cost of selling out, as a GM, I just immediately look at their personal codes and I start thinking, how can I make it so that it's so much easier if they go against those? So I mean, an easy one is like Locker. If I see corporate brands, I'll destroy them. You know, if they sit down to get a job from an agent decked out in corporate brands, then immediately Locker has to either challenge that or sell out a little bit. And I like doing some of those a little more subtle ones, especially in the beginning. I think that if we look at if a vulnerable person is hurt, I'll always show compassion, depending on how you want to indicate hurt. That's another one we can tap into, and we'll kind of see those come into play. So complicate their ideals. You can see there's kind of a theme developing. I won't go into this one too much because there's a GM prep where I'm setting up the first mission, and a lot of the tools around that is about complicating their ideals. But for this team, their ideal is anarchy. And so basically putting them in situations where defying authority is dangerous or gets in the way of their job. Or the other one that I think comes up easier is it goes against anarchy to command other people. But if we start looking at, you know, our characters who want to intimidate and want to disrupt things or weaponize information, as our virtual artist wants to, then that can very easily start being about controlling other people and sort of getting in the way of that. So give each location color. This goes into, you may have seen in some games, they talk about give every NPC a certain amount of traits, or give them this, or give them that. So for this, it's about painting the visual setting a little more. So when we did world building, we already got some touchstones of like the Utah red rocks and the blue sky. So one of my principles as a GM is to continue that sort of color touchstone each time we go into a new scene, and having that contrast some of the other things. So another one, and this is one that will come up when we start looking at faction goals, is to give each NPC a fire and a shadow. And what that means is a fire is something that drives the NPC that they really, really want, and a shadow is something they want to hide or conceal or feel ashamed about. And so one thing I kind of like about this principle and why I put it in there is I don't actually like doing GM prep very much. And so once you get a collection of NPCs that comes with the game that already tells you, okay, this NPC is driven by this and this NPC wants to hide or is afraid of this, then as the GM that kind of gives you something to just play off the characters without having to do too much additional characterization. The remaining ones of these are pretty standard. Give each action a context. So what this is getting at is to not info dump, but to just build the world as you have action unfold. So if one of the players throws someone into a building, then we'll talk about how it's, shattering the political advertisement for some new candidate who's, protesting the overseers. That's a little elaborate, but kind of that idea of just dropping in details about the world as they're happening around the action. And then the last four are very standard. So ask questions and use the answers, be a fan of the players, think dangerous, and begin and end with the fiction. I think the only one there that's slightly different is be a fan of the players. Usually this is written as be a fan of the characters. And I went away from that because I think one thing about the game is a lot of times people are playing kind of anti-heroes, and while you don't want to dislike them because you're playing them, it's a little bit like trying to be a fan of Walter White in Breaking Bad. I know that some people are, but I think a lot of times with anti-heroes it's more about the story's interesting or the conflict's interesting. It isn't necessarily the same as like Dungeon World where you're a fan of these super heroic characters. So the principle instead is that you always need to be a fan of your players as the GM. So what they're interested in, what they want to try, sort of meeting them at that place and encouraging the stories they want to tell and supporting that, even if it's through horrible, horrible anti-hero characters. So, went through all of those because what I need to do is find the faction goals for the main factions the players are going to come up against, because when I start setting the mission that they're going to go on, it's going to be based on what the factions want. So I'm going to switch over chapters, and let's see, so this one I believe is in running the game. Alright, so what this chapter is about for the GM is it takes every team ambition that they can choose, and then it tells you as a GM how to frame your campaign or how to change things or maybe modify to really bring that ambition to life. Now they didn't, and within that each one introduces a new GM tool that really helps with that ambition. That said, even if they're using a different ambition, you can still use the GM tool. It was one way for me to kind of weave in a bunch of different GM advice while trying to give it some organization. So what we're going to see is they didn't choose this goal, but the goal Know My Name, which is all about becoming a legitimate, respected faction, really focuses on faction politics. And so the tool that goes along with it is how to set faction goals. So even though they are going to be doing the Say I'm a Dreamer ambition, and when we look at our first mission, probably during the next stream, that will really focus on that ambition. So, but first we need to get our factions. So this is lots of talky. We're going to skip that. So what a faction wants depends on their relevance, and one of the key assumptions is that every faction wants more power and wants to be more secure. So if you're at the top, you're like that, number level 7 max powerful faction, you want to prevent anyone else from reaching that same power level. And anything below that, you're trying to keep increasing while the other factions are trying to destroy you. And so what I need to do is, I need to find, I actually don't know where I put, there it is. A couple of the factions are more detailed, and these are the ones that are going to be at the player's starting neighborhood, which is why, well, that's not supposed to be blank. That's a little upsetting. Let me go look at versions. There we go. Alright, so I've only done 60 so far, but you can see pretty similar to like Scum and Villainy or Blades in the Dark. You're going to start getting a faction's name, a description of it, you get its relevance. Any faction above relevance 3 has specific qualities, and we'll talk about those as faction goals. You get an agent, which is the main person that the players are going to interact with when they're getting jobs for this faction, and it includes a lot of information like their basic job, some personality traits, what their fire and shadow is, a little bit of background and resources. And then for the faction, you get a couple of pre-generated NPCs, their headquarters, assets, allies, enemies, and starting situation. So this all provides the outline for the goals we're going to start to work on. So we're just going to go in order. And sure, let's do it here. So we have Kennel Crew is the faction that the players have a decreased relationship with. And so first what we want to do is every faction's goal is based a little bit on their relevance. So we're going to go back here and we're going to see what it says about relevance 3 factions. And so whenever you're setting a goal for relevance 3 faction, the main thing is that they are in a very precarious position. They are basically one goal away from being just demolished. So a lot of the more powerful factions will have goals about destroying this one. So when we look at Kennel Crew, who we're starting with, their goal needs to be about increasing their relevance or forming alliances with other factions, because that's how they get more stability and power. So the way that they go up in this system is, like I said, any faction over 3 relevance has a specific quality. And while all factions have these qualities at least a little bit, so if you see something like pervasive, I mean, the faction has to be big enough and common enough that it's become a faction, but the ones that actually have this quality are pretty much the most pervasive factions in the entire colony, so they dominate in this area. And so the way a faction increases their relevance is by securing one of these qualities. So for example, right now we have Kennel Crew. They've got 3 relevance, so they have no qualities, so they need to get one of these qualities, or they need to form an alliance with a powerful faction that will protect them because they're such a low relevance faction. So the problem is the Kennel Crew are kind of rebellious. I was thinking they're kind of like if Pokemon trainers were edgelords, like they're very, it sounds like a cute idea. They have robots and pets and they fight each other, but they're really about getting arrested and rebelling and sort of making a big show of going against the government. And so if we start thinking about alliances, then either people who are really opposed to the government would ally with them, but I think it'd be more interesting, especially because this is a faction that the team has a bad relationship with, if Kennel Crew instead was working on becoming more powerful. So what we can see is they can work on becoming pervasive, which means that they're just completely in every location and kind of saturating the culture. They can be focused on getting the quality consuming, which means that they are basically very aggressive and demolishing rival factions. They can get the quality protective, so they want to focus on protecting themselves no matter what. Or they can be trend setting, which is to be fashionable, cool, desirable, be very what everybody wants. So, to me, yes, I agree. There was actually a really good thread on Twitter a while, I think even just yesterday, of someone playing Pokemon for the first time, and it was like their slow realization that you're just somebody basically doing dog fights with cute creatures. And that was something that kind of inspired this faction a little bit, is even though they're robots, they can look cute, and you're basically just making them be violent against each other, which is not, I don't know, I like animals too much. So this is what I think I'm going to do for them, is consuming starts adding some conflict because they're going to start getting aggressive. Now, if I want to talk about consuming, which is destroying someone, I'm going to start looking at their enemies, because chances are they're going to want to go against anyone, or like consume or destroy or undermine one of their enemies. So one of their enemies is a faction called Bleach Code. And this is interesting to me because Bleach Code is a faction that is all about erasing. So one of the things in the world is, because the source is in everything, it's in machines too. And so there's this idea that machines have something called the echo. So when anyone creates a machine or modifies a machine, they leave an echo of themselves, and it's almost like, if you think of a traditional ghost that's kind of stuck in repetition, reenacting the same thing. That's kind of what the echo is. It's not fully sentient, but it sort of reflects the traits of its creator. So Bleach Code is all about erasing the echo from the machine. And so they see that sort of sentient response by the source as an infection, as a corruption of technology, and they want to find a way to just completely destroy it. And they are rumored to have some illegal kill switch technology that they've stolen from the overseers in order to do that. So, I think a goal for Kennel Crew is they want to get the consuming quality by hurting Bleach Code. And so we get them going against a faction which in some ways is kind of gross on its own, because it's trying to just destroy any sign of life inside the machine. So in some ways that makes them a little more interesting. They're not just going after the government, but they're still going to be doing it in a pretty violent way. So Bleach Code, I need to pull up. Let's see. Alright, so we're going to look at them real quick, because we need to know what their relevance is. Going down to Cyber Circle. Alright, so their relevance 3. So all that Kennel Crew has to do is basically one final project to hurt Bleach Code, and that will destroy them as a faction. So they are an anonymous cyber gang, and they're very, very militant about their secrecy, and they only interact with outsiders through proxies. So pretty much their first goal is going to be to identify a real member of Bleach Code. So for example, maybe kidnap a proxy, get information from them, etc. So I don't tend to do a lot of details about faction goals in the moment. You just want to kind of know what the tension point is, because that gives you room when you are starting to play out what's going on to respond to players. So it's more like a creative prompt. So I know that they're really wanting to find one of the proxies of Bleach Code and get some solid information about them. I think to eventually locate one of their bases or sort of headquarters. So that is Kennel Crew. And part of what we can also see for Kennel Crew is one of their allies, which makes this make a lot of sense, is the faction called the Neo-Human Emulation Lab, which is also just known as NEL. And what that is some of the AI either survived the kill switch or have been reactivated, and they've kind of created this hive. And so there's this faction of secret artificial intelligence, and their goal is to find other artificial intelligence, reactivate them, and find a way off the planet, because according to the quarantine, no AI can continue to exist. So they want to get off the planet to somewhere where they can continue to exist, because since they're AI, they remember before the quarantine and what that was like. And so that kind of ties into Kennel Crew, because they have this alliance with the artificial intelligence faction. And so the idea of hurting Bleach Code makes a lot of sense, because Bleach Code is basically trying to wipe out sentience. Alright, let's look. Aha, so the next one we have is the Land Allotments for All Special Interest Group, or LAFA. And this is our team's positive relationship. So what LAFA does is they're a SIG is the short word for special interest groups. They're a political group that thinks that basically the barrier around the colony and the restriction on moving outside the colony is ridiculous and just a form of control by the government, and that it should be dropped so everybody can own land, because right now land is very limited and scarce. And so they yes, so LAFA is unfortunately, though, protests have turned violent recently. But one thing is if we go down to the situation, LAFA doesn't think they caused the violence. They think one of their enemy factions created it so that they would become less popular, and the peacekeepers, who are like kind of the police / military in this world, would ban them. So they think that this violence isn't anyone from their organization, really. They think it's all about political maneuvering and undermining. So LAFA is also Relevance 3. So what I think would be more interesting for LAFA is, because they're already in this political situation where they're being undermined, is if we go back to the goals for Relevance 3, they could try and increase it by gaining equality, but I think it'd be more interesting if they tried to improve their alliance with a faction to sort of politically fight back against this person who's trying to undermine them. So if we look, they start with some powerful allies. One is Starstream. I think they're a Relevance 5 or 6 faction. They're all focused on feed entertainment. But the more interesting one is Cytoxin. So Cytoxin is, let's go down to them, because I don't think we've talked about them before. And yes, so they're one of the Lawbreaker factions. And Cytoxin is another Relevance 3, so it'd be kind of safety in numbers. And they are a black market distributor that started by selling illegal pharma, which are illegal drugs created by the multicore that also created the epidemic. And since they were created by that same multicore, they were banned. But Cytoxin is making money selling these pharma, and it seems they may have actually reactivated one of the old fabricators to make the pharma, which is generating their supply. So when a faction wants to increase their or improve their relationship with another faction, they start looking at how they can protect them or help them with their goal. So if we think about Cytoxin, they are very illegal and they are messing around with forbidden drugs, and they want to expand to start running auctions for unregulated goods, basically expand their black market dealings. So LAFA, even though they have this violence problem, they still are sort of a respectable front. So their goal is going to be to host a black market auction for Cytoxin that is successful. And so with this, we start seeing smaller goals, so they need to arrange for security, probably distract the peacekeepers, so maybe, for example, they could hold a rally, help communicate through respectable channels, and so on and so forth. So that's what LAFA is going to be focused on. Is right now they feel like they can't really deal with the faction that they think is undermining them, so they're going to get their criminal friend Cytoxin sort of rising up in the criminal world with more money through these black market auctions, and then bank on Cytoxin turning around and offering them protection. So, and you can start to see like any of these small goals can become missions for the players, or it can start going back to that principle of making players choose, because they can always be hired to do something that's going to conflict with LAFA's goal and then have to decide, are they going to continue the mission they're hired for, or are they going to back the faction that they already have a positive relationship with. So, alright. And the next faction is Cash Shield Security. They're relevance 4, and they are that because they have the consuming quality. So that means basically they swallow up or dismantle rival security firms. So this starts getting interesting with the Cytoxin faction goals, because what Cash Shield does is they provide personal protection and interrogation services, but they do it by weaponizing mind-bending pharma to chemically restrain their targets. So there's probably a good chance that their pharma is supplied by Cytoxin, because they're the ones specializing in it. Or if it's not, then they're getting it from a source. So if we start going over, let's look at what relevance 4 factions do. So we got the relevance 3. So relevance 4 to 6 factions fall in the middle, and so they're not at the very bottom, they're not at the very top. So they have a couple of options. They can work on gaining relevance, so trying to gain another quality. They can try and build alliances, so they can basically do whatever a relevance 3 faction is. Or they can focus on eliminating competitors. So if you want to eliminate a faction completely, you have to lower its relevance to 3 and then basically take a final goal or project to destroy them. And so how you do that is the reverse of how a faction becomes a faction. And by that, you look at if they have any qualities and you try and strip that from them. So I think it'd be interesting if Cash Shield was being aggressive and trying to attack someone. Now, so far the factions we looked at were both relevance 3, so there's nothing to really strip from them right now. So I'm going to keep going. And alright. What the heck? Let me make sure they're not allies before I set the goal against them. They are not. Okay. So Cash Shield wants to try and undercut another faction. And sometimes this will be someone who's directly opposed to them, like an enemy. But it can also be a faction that is just of a similar relevance, because at the end of the day, every faction wants to be basically top dog, wants to be the most powerful. And for starting situations, I think it's more interesting if all of the faction goals are basically intertwining these 6 neighborhood factions, because you start getting a lot more conflict out of that. So our security firm can go after this last one, which is the Circle of Crystal Winds. And what they are is they are an off-worlder owned faction that is all about selling magical charms, trinkets, and spell formulas for the non-magical. There's a lot of questions about whether or not their products actually work. Most people would say no, that it's all superstition. However, it's complicated because inspectors will often confiscate things when they're doing a sweep and then sell them to the Crystal Winds for money. So sometimes Crystal Winds gets genuine magical artifacts because some inspector just, swept it up and decided to sell it for their, sort of side payment. So, Cash Shield is a security firm, and they really are not going to like the idea that this kind of hokey, touchy-feely, magically questionable company makes people think they can just buy a charm and that will be secure enough. So, if we start looking at them, they are going to want, it's a relationship, they are going to want to lower the relevance of Crystal Winds by stripping them of their trend-setting quality. So right now, Crystal Winds is very in vogue and very popular, and so they're going to want to strip that away. And they're a security firm that specializes in using pharma with negative consequences. So they are going to poison and corrupt Crystal Winds stock to start causing illness and negative effects. So you can see some of the mini goals are going to be developing the pharma agent, getting access to Crystal Winds stock, and then bringing attention to the suffering customers. So they basically want to focus bad PR. So if the team were playing, for example, one of the performers factions, or performers team, which is all about manipulating public opinion, that would be just like a perfect mission for them. But yes, poison all of the off-worlders. And oh man, your character's gonna love that. I don't know though, because your mystic wants to, have compassion towards people. It's gonna be so fun. So that is gonna be Cash Shield, is they are going to sabotage Crystal Winds, and all of their poor, naive, off-worlder customers who think they're gonna get protective charms are going to get really bad effects. And their hope is if they can make it so Crystal Winds is not as popular. And again, trend setting as a quality means they're one of the most popular factions, so even just hurting their popularity a little bit could strip them of that quality, and then they would be a relevance 3 faction. And then Cash Shield could either ignore them because they're not more powerful than them, or they could really go after them and make their next faction goal about just destroying Crystal Winds. So we'll have to see where that goes. So, our next faction is going to be... You can have compassion towards people you're hurting. I mean, I will love to see you make that argument, and see how Craig responds to that argument. But even more than that, I'm really curious what sides the other characters will take, because I feel like your broker wants to be a good person but is struggling, but your cyborg might just be like, let's rampage and, destroy them all. So let's see. Who else do we have? Okay, so the next faction in this area is Oxlife Games. So they're another one that has no relationship with the team yet. And Oxlife is a developer of feed games that are known for very experimental designs and immersive interfaces that some groups think, oh, yes, I feel like covering off-rollers and brand logos is going to become a very good strategy for getting your cyborg on your side. Or he'll resist and then he'll get sellout points. So, we'll see. So Oxlife, their games are suspiciously immersive, and there are some groups that are starting to say that they are addictive. And there's some truth to that because they're using techniques that violate regulations. And so they sort of maintain aliases and anonymity, both because their techniques go against regulation, but also because it really creates this mystery that their fans have turned into a major sort of nest of conspiracy theories. So, like, on one hand, they're just very money focused, excellent programmers of games, but on the other hand, there's this element of sort of conspiracies about who are they and how do they do what they do. And one of the things that I don't know if I want to talk about the agents. You'll find out. But it gets complicated once you start looking at some of the fire and shadow elements of the NPCs in this faction. So they are also, one of their assets, we haven't really talked about faction assets, is they have unmonitored feed links. So most feed links, how people connect to the feed, are sponsored by factions and are monitored if they're on. And so Oxlife has, in some ways, anonymity because they connect with feed links that are not owned by any of the sponsor factions. The other thing they have that isn't well known is they might have some kill switch technology, so they can disable other people's technology. So they're another 4. So they're going to basically look at gaining a new quality, gaining an ally, or attacking another faction. And I think for Oxlife, they're going to try and get a new quality. They want to be like a Relevance 5 faction. So if we look at the qualities, let's see. So they're already protective. So they could be consuming, protective, or pervasive, or trend setting. So let's see. Consuming, I think we've already done. You know what? They want to be trend setting, but they're gonna do it. Want to gain trend setting by building an alliance with Crystal Winds. So I think Crystal Winds is the only trend setting faction in the neighborhood. So they're like the ones who are, they know how to be popular and be very in style. So Oxlife wants that, and they're going to do that by sort of building an alliance with Crystal Winds. Um, but let's see. How do we make this? So, ooh. So, this is where we start getting into politics and relationships. One of Crystal Wind's allies is an armory faction, and the armory factions are the ones that are legally allowed to have weapons and armor and probably took over some armory depots during sort of the chaos of the epidemic. They have an ally called Bullet Solutions Inc., which is pretty much the thuggiest of thug mercenaries you can get. So Bullet Solutions is not just a name, it is also their favorite method for any job they're hired for. So, I don't actually know. It's almost like there's this GM thing about making you choose. So Crystal Winds is allies with Bullet Solutions, so Oxlife is going to help Bullet Solutions upgrade their weapons with digital tech. And so, perhaps, for example, stealing from real life, there are like kind of VR programs to train people to basically shoot better, have better tactics, etc. So Oxlife is going to go from being all about making those, immersive feed apps to creating technology to help Bullet Solutions train better so that they can become even more successful and deadly and become kind of the most tech savvy of the thug mercenaries. So in order to do that, they need to get some advanced weapons to study them. And so they're going to steal weapons from Kurgan, which is a multi-core that's all about making the most elite weapons. And Kurgan happens to be an enemy of Crystal Winds, so they'll be cool with that. So they're going to steal weapons from Kurgan. They're going to engineer weapon enhancement apps. This is kind of hand wavy at this point because I don't know how that'll go exactly. And then they are going to gain enough supplies to outfit all of Bullet Solutions. And so that may involve stealing or raiding in order to do that. So that's what Oxlife is going to do. We're coming up on 9, but I started late because of tech problems. So we're going to go ahead and try and finish these last two. So, yes, we're to Perplex Crew. They are a lawbreaker faction, and what they do is they make very high quality fake credentials. So since one of our relevance factors, this becomes even more important, is having credentials, Perplex is experts at making them. And Brian, I think I might have stolen this from a faction you made or Jesper made, because when they give you the credentials, then the rest of your life you owe them, so they can basically call in favors. So they have people planted. Their relevance for the quality pervasive, so they have people planted all across society because people needed credentials. Perplex gave them to them, and then basically had their loyalty for life. And so let's see what their starting situation is. Okay, so one of Perplex's people were discovered at Ashen Academy. So Ashen Academy is the premier official off-worlder run training site for credentialed magicians. And so Perplex, one of their people, their credentials were discovered to be fake, and their person has gone missing. And so that's going to be their starting situation. So I think that they want to gain the protective quality because Ashen, let's see, I think they're a higher relevance. Let's go to the arcane. Yeah, so Ashen is relevance 5, so Perplex can't really take them on unless they become a higher relevance. So they want to gain the protective. Right now they have pervasive. They want to, let's gain the protective quality. So, a lot of what their specialty is right now is forgery and fakes and crime, and not having much power. So, oh, I know what I'm gonna do. So one of their allies is a supply faction. It's basically a business faction called Talavent Limited. And what Talavent does is they sell extreme experience packs where they take you out into the areas past the colony barrier. And you it's kind of like their version of a safari, like, hey, let's go out into the wild, you know, unsafe area that's being ripped apart by magic, and you can have all these experiences. And they, you know, sort of protect people and let them take cool feed videos, and it's very chic with a certain group. So, but what that means is Talavent has sort of exposure to a lot of paracritters, so animals and wildlife that have been warped by the source, and parabotany. And so Perplex is going to become more protective. We already have a lot of people messing around with drugs, so they are going to, by getting Talavent to supply them with deadly paracritters. Or something more dangerous. So one of the things I don't think we really talked about too much on stream is there are creatures that live in the other dimensions, and most of those are very cooperative and friendly, and some of them, however, seem to feed on human fear. And so those are called the Dread, and they basically go about trying to create fear-inspiring scenarios so that they can feed off it when humans feel it. So the barrier keeps them out. Well, it doesn't keep them out entirely. It limits their abilities. That's part of why the barrier is up. So it could be that Perplex is going to get deadly paracritters, or they could get an alliance with these other dimensional creatures that literally inspire fear and horror. So that would make them pretty dang protective, and also Ashen would be very afraid of those creatures. So their first goals are going to be, I think, because this is Perplex, they're going to infiltrate Talavent, even though they're an ally. Steal their maps of the unregulated zones. Steal some anti-magic equipment. I don't have a cool name for that right now. And capture some deadly outbreak creatures, which are just the name for the magical creatures. So they may lose their ally by doing that, but Perplex is all about sort of espionage. They never ask straight out. And their goal is to get these really deadly creatures so that they are powerful enough to challenge Ashen, which would also put them full on against the Overseers. So that brings us to our last faction, And this is Crystal, Circle of Crystal Winds. Alright. So their relevance 4. What did they want to do? I think they want to lower someone's relevance. I mean, they are friends with Bullet Solutions. It seems like they have sort of the clear tool there. So we have to look at one of the other relevance 4 factions. Now they could go after Cash Shield. No, they can't. They're too low. No, they could go after Cash Shield, but I think it's more interesting to make it asymmetrical, so not having those two go at each other, but having Crystal Winds go after someone else. So they could go after Oxlife, or they could go after Perplex. They want... I think they want to go... I think they want to go after Perplex. Because Perplex, even though they're not trend-setting, they're very pervasive, and Crystal Winds wants to become the most pervasive. Like, eventually they want to be sort of the biggest influence in this neighborhood. So, what is their starting situation? Oh yeah, that makes sense, actually. So, Crystal Winds has stalls literally over all of the colonies, and they make incredibly fast deliveries, and part of their secret is they actually have AI couriers, and those couriers have started to go missing, which is very concerning because AI are extremely illegal. So they want to hunt down whoever is taking them out before they start having supply gaps and before maybe someone notices that there's some AI weirdness going on. So it makes sense that they would suspect Perplex, because Perplex is all about espionage and being kind of stabbing people in the back before they ever see you coming. And so they're going to blame Perplex. And that also kind of makes sense because one of Crystal Wind's allies is the Inspectors, so they kind of want to blame the big criminal group in the area. So, let's see. I'm just looking at the NPCs to see if there's something I want to take here. So what they want to do is they want to attack Perplex's pervasive quality by creating inner turmoil. The reason I went with that is their agent, her shadow, so her thing she's trying to hide, is a past cruelty. And that could be something that was done to her, but in this case I think it's something that she did. And she's an adjudicator heritage, so her family's probably peacekeepers, but they were assassinated by Planetborn because people still see adjudicators often as traitors. So if we put that together, she probably did something to Planetborn that was very bad. And since Crystal Winds have the allies of the Inspectors, they probably know it. So they're going to create the inner turmoil by using their Inspector connections to find out the leadership's secrets and create a loss of confidence. Because Perplex, I mean, most of their customers are Planetborn because they're selling fake credentials to the people who have the hardest time getting them. So if they find out that one of their main faction leaders maybe did something terrible to Planetborn, that would be pretty destabilizing. So they need to do things like probably convince Inspectors to help them, even though they're allies. You know, if you're going to do something super, they might want a little extra payment to help them. Prove the leadership's crimes, and then reveal those crimes in the most damaging way. So that is gonna be their faction goal. So kind of to review, Kennel Crew's doing their own kind of thing. They want to become more powerful by hurting Bleach Code, which is a different neighborhood faction. Lafa wants to become more powerful by moving into the illegal black market auction business with a criminal faction. Cashield wants to undermine Crystal Winds by poisoning their products to hurt their reputation. Oxlife wants to build an alliance with Crystal Winds by helping Bullet Solutions become more deadly, which involves stealing from the most powerful multi-core still in existence. Perplex wants to become more protective by infiltrating their ally Talavent to secure very deadly supernatural power from the creatures outside the barrier. And Crystal Winds wants to just basically create a civil war within the big criminal faction by revealing leadership's terrible, terrible secrets. And so you can start seeing that we have a lot of politics and interweaving going on. And that's just with these couple of factions. So as the players move out of the colonies, we'll start setting goals for the other factions. And yeah, so that's kind of our relationship chaos map that the players are going to walk into, and they're going to be hired for a job for one of these factions, and no matter who they work for, they're going to be making someone else very angry. And so we'll start to see how they handle that when they start taking on the jobs that factions themselves wouldn't want to do. So that is basically an intro to the GM principles and an intro to setting goals. And I think next time, let me look. So the one thing we didn't talk about is a Relevance 7 faction, because in this neighborhood, none of those factions are the primary ones. So Relevance 7 are the Overseers are one. I actually think, I want to say there's a couple others. Vault Dex, which is in charge of basically the technology that locked down all the astrotech and prevents interstellar travel. There is 7. And there's Sliverlight Syndicate is a criminal faction. So there's very few of them. I think it may be just those 3. Let's see. So another time I'll set one of their goals. The only difference in terms of the mechanics for setting a goal for a Relevance 7 faction is their goal is about destroying other factions. So just like Relevance 4 and 6 can work on it, that's what Relevance 7 does, is they look at a faction, they look at their qualities, they strip them away, or they look at a faction that's already a 3, and they look at consuming them or just demolishing them. And so that'll be something once I bring in one of the Relevance 7, and that'll probably depend how many sessions we play if I do that, because they're a little bit of like a mid-campaign instrument of when the really powerful faction comes in and starts, you know, for example, destroying players' ally factions that are weak. So, alright. Well, I think that's all we're going to do for tonight. And then what we're going to do the next time is I'm going to create what is called the campaign threat. So every game you play is by default set up for kind of a campaign structure, and in the background there's this campaign threat that is doing bad stuff and basically trying to increase corruption in the world. and the players can't ever go at that directly. They kind of just deal with the fallout and they can try and stop it in indirect methods. And so what that does is, even though they're not the main adversary that the players fight, it gives kind of a common thread to some of that sense of chaos and conflict that's going on, and also creates this threat that sort of becomes more and more present and obvious as the campaign develops. And so there's a set of rules for how to do that. And we will do that. I think I'm planning on probably doing that next Monday. It depends on when our next session is. If I have 2 weeks, I will maybe do it as early as this Friday. If we have 3 weeks, then I'm just going to do this every Monday because that works with my schedule pretty well. But anyway, thank you for those of you who came out, and I'm kind of excited to see how Brian and the other players deal with all these conflicting loyalties of the factions and where they end up falling. And we'll see that couriers can really fit into a lot of it, because couriers move products, but one of the other mission types they have is they can be envoys. And what that is they can carry messages into areas other people don't want to go. So as we start seeing some of these really powerful factions battling it out, maybe the players are going to get hired as an envoy to go in and carry a message into that, because factions don't want to send any other people. That would be dangerous and wasteful. But yeah, yes, all of the off-worlders, all of them. And then you can be the supreme leader of the neighborhood. And that's actually one goal I didn't set yet, is the neighborhood itself is a faction. And so they will have a goal that represents the neighborhood. So for this would be the capsule tower. And I think I might have set that goal, but that one I'm not going to do on screen right now or review it, because that would be a spoiler for Brian. But the capsule as a neighborhood has some of their own what they want in the middle of this. So, and that'll be who the players supposedly are going to try and help out inside, because they chose the Say I'm a Dreamer, I think it was, and that is about building up your community. So what they may find is, conflict-wise, is you have all these factions making all these big power moves, and then you have your capsule tower and kind of your normal people trying to do what's best for them. And often that will probably be going against these factions that are creating violent weapons and poisons and, you know, killing people to make a point and creating turmoil. So it'd be kind of cool. But yeah, I hope you all have a good night or morning wherever you are.